In this video, we're going to start learning about doing black and white toning, which is to say giving a black and white image a tone, a color tone like you would in the darkroom with chemistry, like a sepia toning or selenium toning. Here I have this image open. It's a color image at the moment. It's not a very saturated color kind of image, but it's a color image nonetheless. This image was originally opened as a smart object. Good practices. We see the smart object icon at the lower corner of that thumbnail. To convert this to black and white, I'm going to double click on that icon, and this will open the image back into Adobe Camera Raw. And here's the image in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to go up to the top of my basic panel here and turn on black and white. If this image had a lot of variation in color, I might also want to go to this tab, the black and white mix, and decide how do I want different colors to translate into black and white tones. This image doesn't really have a lot of color variation, but you can see that as I adjust yellows and oranges, we see a little bit of changing of those tonalities. If I pull back here, now I'm going to go down, and you may need to do this, to this link at the bottom. Now oftentimes when you switch to black and white, Adobe will want to now open your image up as a grayscale file. Make sure that you are, for this purpose, for this technique, opening the image back up as Adobe RGB 1998. Even though the image will look black and white, it is still going to be a color file, and we're going to need it to be a color file to do this technique. Okay, I'm going to say OK, and Photoshop will update that smart object layer when I click OK at the bottom here too. And our image is now black and white back in Photoshop. The smart object you see at the bottom is also a black and white image. The layers that I built on top of that image are still in play. They're still doing what they do in terms of changing the contrast of different areas of this picture. That has not changed. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a tonal range selection or a mask eventually. And to do a tonal range selection, I'm going to click on the Channels tab in my Layers palette. If you don't know where that is, it's usually nested with layers in the same palette if you're in the photography workspace. And I'm going to hold down the Command key and click on the RGB channel. And by doing this, I'm going to get a highlight-based selection. It looks like I've got marching ants all over the place on this picture, but really what this is showing me, or trying to show me, is that the highlights are selected the most, the midtones are selected somewhat, and the darker areas, the shadow tones, are selected very little. They are selected, and anything that I eventually do to this image will happen there a little bit, but it's going to happen mostly in the highlights, a little less in the shadows, and very little, I'm sorry, a little bit in the midtones and very little in the shadows. So this is a highlight-based selection that I got by command clicking on the RGB layer. But what I really want is a shadow-based selection. So I'm going to go to the Select menu and choose Inverse. I'm going to invert that selection. If you like keystrokes, Shift-Command-I. Doesn't look much different, but now it's actually reversed. Now my shadows are selected the most, midtones just a little bit, highlights very little at all. I'm going to go back to the Layers tab in that palette, and I'm going to build a solid color adjustment layer up on top of all of my layers. So first I'll go and select the topmost layer, because I know anything that I do now will be built on top of that. And I like to build upward. I'm going to now click on my adjustment layer button and choose the very top option, solid color. And I get kind of a weird, very dark image to start with, because by default my color picker is giving me pure black. I don't want to just add pure black tone. What I can do now is to click around on the color picker, and you see different shades, in this case of red, more saturation to the right, less saturation to the left, lighter up at the top, darker toward the bottom. I also have a hue slider over here, and I'm going to move this up into kind of a reddish orange range to approximate more of a sepia tone. In fact, maybe I'm going to move it a little bit more toward yellow, and I'll show you how we can adjust that later. In terms of creating a sepia tone, generally I like to pick a color that is on the light side and not terribly saturated. I'm not going to be all the way to the left. I definitely don't want to be all the way to the right. maybe about a third of the way across is a good starting point. I'm going to click OK. Now it doesn't look right just yet, but we haven't done our next step, which is go back to the layers palette and switch from normal to multiply on the blending mode. And now we get a lot better looking toned black and white image. Now to me it's a little bit too much on the yellow side and maybe a little bit too saturated, but this is a subjective call. If you want to adjust that color, all you have to do is double click on the icon for that new solid color layer and open up the color picker again by doing so, and you can change the color. Again, as you go down, you get darker. As you go up, you get lighter. If you go to the left, you get less saturation. If you go to the right, you get more saturation. And if you want to change the hue, then you move this slider over on just the right side of that main color picker area. So I'm going to move the hue just a little bit more toward red-orange, and I'm going to move this little circle that's picking my color just a little bit more to the left, maybe somewhere in there. And I think that gives me a really nice sepia tone. Now that's only one tone. What if we wanted to have a little bit of a duotone, a couple different tones running through that picture? Maybe warmth in the deep shadows, maybe a little bit cooler in the midtones. Well, I'll show you that in our next part.